World War I was absolutely brutal for soldiers, with Allied and German armies facing each other across roughly 400 miles of trenches, stretching from the North Sea to Switzerland. In between was no man's land, a wasteland with barbed wire, corpses, and cratered mud. For the average World War I soldier, the real enemy wasn't just bullets. It was the ground itself, trenches flooded, boots rotted, trench foot turned toes black. Lice and rats were everywhere, feeding off wounds and the recently deceased. The stench of rot, excrement, and the unburied never left. Then came the gas. In 1915, Germany deployed chlorine gas. It burned lungs, blinded eyes, and suffocated men in minutes. Masks followed, but they were crude. A leak or delay could mean permanent damage. Or worse. Even without gas, injuries often led to a slow demise. Artillery shells ripped bodies apart. Field hospitals, when they existed, were overwhelmed. No antibiotics meant infection spread fast. A small wound could mean amputation. A bigger one meant morphine, if you were lucky, and a shovel if you weren't. And through it all, the generals kept pushing. Frontal assaults were ordered again and again, based on the theory that enough bodies would break the line. At the Somme, 20,000 British soldiers lost their lives on the first day. Passchendaele turned into a swamp of blood for less than 5 miles of ground. Psychological collapse, then called shell shock, was rampant, but many commanders saw it as cowardice. Soldiers were punished, even executed, for what we now understand as trauma. By the time the war ended in 1918, it had taken millions of lives and broken millions more. On June 22, 1941, Hitler launched Operation Barbarossa, an all-out invasion of the Soviet Union. It was the largest military campaign in history, and it became a meat grinder on a scale the world had never seen. The front stretched over 1,000 miles across vast forests and steppes, dwarfing the scale of other World War II theaters. But the space didn't mean mobility. It meant exposure. Troops marched into endless forests, only to be stranded by the cold, starved by logistics, and erased by artillery. By early 1942, over 4 million Soviet troops had lost their lives, were wounded, or went missing. German casualties were piling up too. But in this theater, bodies weren't just a statistic. Everyone was replaceable. Entire armies disappeared, reformed, and were sent back into the fire, sometimes within weeks. The cold was another enemy. German troops expected a quick victory, but they got frostbite, stalled engines, and frozen rifles. It got so cold some soldiers didn't wake up from their frozen slumber. Others lost fingers and toes. Horses were shot just to keep men warm with their hides. Then came Stalingrad. The city turned into a blender. Street by street, building by building, the two sides tore each other apart. Snipers hunted from rubble. Men fought with knives, bricks, and bare hands in stairwells and basements. By the end, German soldiers were eating rats and boiling wallpaper glue for calories. They were trapped, cut off, and left to starve. Those who surrendered didn't necessarily live. On both sides, prisoners were often treated as subhuman. Soviet POWs captured by the Germans lost their lives from hunger and execution. Axis troops taken by the Soviets fared little better. Disease, malnutrition, and forced labor took many of these soldiers long after the shooting had stopped. Medical care was primitive. Supplies barely reached the front. Most soldiers perished without ever seeing a proper hospital. If the cold didn't get you, the trench rot or dysentery might. No other front in World War II came close to this scale of destruction. Over 30 million fatalities. And whether you fought for Stalin or Hitler, the Eastern Front didn't care. On paper, it was Iraq versus Iran, two nations fighting over borders and oil fields. In reality, it was 8 years of chemical attacks and mass sacrifice of teenage soldiers. When Iraq invaded in 1980, they expected a quick win. What followed was one of the longest conventional wars of the 20th century, fought mostly by young conscripts, many barely old enough to shave. Iran's government, still reeling from revolution, leaned heavily on teenage volunteers. Some were 14 or even younger. Many were sent straight to the front lines with minimal training. In some cases, they were used to walk ahead of armored columns, deliberately setting off mines with their bodies. The fighting froze into fortified defenses across scorching deserts and flooded marshes. Summer heat hit 120 degrees Fahrenheit, 49 degrees Celsius. Winter rains turned bunkers into swamps. Supply chains failed constantly. Soldiers shared water bottles, reused bandages, and patched gear with whatever they could scavenge. Then came the gas. Iraq deployed chemical weapons repeatedly. Mustard gas, then nerve agents like sarin and taboon. Iranian troops had often no protective gear. Some were handed masks that didn't seal. Others had nothing. Field hospitals weren't much better. Supplies ran out fast. Bombardments continued even behind the lines. Some medical stations were hit with chemical shells. Survival often came down to luck. By 1988, there were over 1 million casualties and wounded. Neither side gained territory. No strategic objectives were achieved, but entire generations were scarred, physically and mentally. Veterans returned home with damaged lungs, ruined nerves, and little support. Many still live with chronic pain, psychological trauma, and the long-term effects of chemical exposure. For most U.S. soldiers, the Vietnam War was about surviving in the jungle. From the moment boots hit the ground, the terrain became the enemy. Dense foliage swallowed vision. Trails became traps. Every step could trigger a punji pit, a tripwire, or worse, an enemy you never saw. Temperatures soared above 100 degrees Fahrenheit, 37 degrees Celsius, with crushing humidity. Monsoons flooded roads and foxholes. Troops carried 60 to 80 pounds of gear, often soaked, through mud that never dried. Mosquitoes swarmed constantly. Leeches latched onto legs. Malaria, dysentery, and skin infections could take out entire platoons without a shot fired. And like the previous wars, here too were chemicals. From 1962 to 1971, the U.S. military sprayed over 11 million gallons of Agent Orange across Vietnam. Officially, it was about defoliation, removing jungle cover and cutting off food supplies to Viet Cong fighters. Unofficially, many troops walked, slept, and ate in freshly sprayed zones. They were told it was safe. It wasn't. Agent Orange contained dioxin, one of the most toxic compounds ever used in war. Veterans exposed during service later developed cancers, nerve disorders, and chronic illnesses. Some passed those effects on to children born with deformities, immune issues, and unexplained conditions. The government denied the link for years. Then there was no front line. Guerrilla warfare meant the enemy could be anywhere or nowhere. Ambushes came without warning. Tunnel networks let Viet Cong vanish after striking. Even bases weren't safe. Combat was constant, but progress was invisible. And then the war ended in 1975 with the fall of Saigon. Many veterans came home to a country that didn't welcome them. The wounds, physical, chemical, and psychological, stayed with them. In June 1812, Napoleon Bonaparte led over 500,000 troops and support personnel into Russia, the largest European military force ever assembled at the time. Their goal was to force the Russian Empire into submission, but they never even got a surrender. The campaign began under intense summer heat. Soldiers marched for hundreds of miles across Eastern Europe, weighed down by gear, straining supply lines with every step. But the Russian army refused to fight. Instead, they fell back, burning villages, crops, bridges, and wells as they went. The further Napoleon advanced, the less there was to survive on. In September, the French finally engaged the Russian army at Borodino, a single-day bloodbath that produced over 70,000 casualties. The French technically won the field, but failed to destroy the enemy or force terms. And every day brought winter closer. Weeks later, Napoleon entered Moscow expecting negotiations. Instead, he found silence and fire. The city had been evacuated, and much of it was in flames, set by the Russians themselves. No food, no government, no victory speech. Napoleon waited nearly a month for a peace offering that never came. The army stalled, and the weather turned. On October 19th, Napoleon ordered the retreat. Then came the real war. Temperatures plunged to -22 degrees Fahrenheit, -30 degrees Celsius. Most of the Grande Armée had no proper winter clothing. Frostbite spread fast. Horses collapsed and were butchered for food. Supply depots had been stripped or destroyed by Russian partisans. Soldiers began dropping by the thousands, not from bullets, but from exposure and starvation. Disease struck next. Typhus, dysentery, and exhaustion took many lives during the retreat. Soldiers abandoned their weapons to lighten the load. Discipline broke down. Entire units disappeared into the snow. In late November, what remained of the army reached the Berezina River. Bridges had to be hastily constructed under enemy fire. Russian forces pressed from all sides. Thousands drowned in the icy water or were trampled in the chaos. It was a total collapse. By the time the remnants staggered out of Russian territory, just an estimated 20,000 to 50,000 combat-capable troops remained. Over 300,000 lives were lost, most from cold, disease, or starvation. Russian and Allied losses pushed the total campaign number of perished to an estimated 500 to 600,000. Napoleon left his army behind and returned to Paris in December. The American Civil War was where 19th century medicine met 19th century firepower, and lost. Between 1861 and 1865, an estimated 620 to 750,000 soldiers lost their lives. But the rifle wasn't the deadliest weapon on the battlefield. That title goes to dysentery, typhoid, and plain bad sanitation. Over half the casualties came from disease. Camps were overcrowded, filthy, and poorly planned. Latrines were dug too close to water sources. Food spoiled. Quarters flooded. Men slept in wet tents, drank contaminated water, and passed infections faster than bullets ever could. Doctors, for the most part, had no idea why. Germ theory wasn't accepted yet. Surgeons moved from patient to patient without washing their hands. Instruments were reused without sterilization. Bandages were rinsed in buckets and reapplied. Injuries from Civil War weapons, especially soft lead mini balls, were devastating. Limbs shattered on impact. Rather than trying to save them, surgeons sawed them off. Amputation was the default treatment. Without antiseptics or antibiotics, infection followed. Many soldiers survived the battlefield only to lose their lives days later. Even off the battlefield, the risks were high. Measles, pneumonia, and malaria moved freely through regiments. Malaria could be managed with quinine, if it was available. Most other infections, you just hoped your body won the fight. Antietam, the bloodiest single day in American military history, saw over 3,600 men lose their lives and nearly 23,000 casualties. But the aftermath may have been worse. Wounded soldiers lay untreated for hours or days. Flies swarmed open wounds. By the war's end, disease had taken twice as many men as combat had. The Civil War forced a reckoning. It exposed the cost of waging industrial-scale war with medieval medical tools, and it marked a turning point, not in just how America fought, but in how it failed to care for those who fought for it. The 30 Years' War started as a fight over religion. It ended 3 decades later with no clear winner and entire regions of Europe ruined. From 1618 to 1648, Central Europe, especially the Holy Roman Empire, became the battleground for a war that kept changing shape. Protestant versus Catholic turned into empire versus empire. France, Spain, Sweden, the Habsburgs. Nearly every major European power got involved. But for the average soldier, the big politics didn't matter, because on the ground, this war was chaos. There were no fixed fronts. Campaigns dragged on for years. Most armies were cobbled together from mercenaries, poorly trained, barely paid, and totally unregulated. Soldiers weren't just fighting, they were surviving, and survival often meant looting. With supply chains unreliable at best, armies lived off the land, which meant stealing food, livestock, and shelter from whatever villages they passed through. Civilians were essentially the supply line. Entire communities were wiped out by hungry soldiers who were supposed to protect them. Medical care was almost non-existent. If you were wounded, you got an amputation, if you were lucky. Diseases like typhus, dysentery, and the plague tore through camps. Sieges were especially lethal. Weeks or months of starvation, disease, and trench rot with no clean water and no escape. Morale broke down constantly. Pay was delayed or stolen. Orders changed by the week. Desertion was common, and punishment ranged from flogging to execution. Some soldiers weren't even volunteers. They were peasants conscripted by nobles or captured and forced to serve. And the war just didn't end. Whole generations knew nothing but marching, burning, and fighting. Some regions of what is now Germany lost over half their population. Famine followed armies like a shadow. Cities were emptied, farmland turned into wilderness. And the reason for the war, a conflict over religion, was long forgotten by the time peace was finally signed. The Korean War began fast. On June 25, 1950, North Korean forces stormed across the 38th parallel. Within weeks, Seoul had fallen. Within months, U.S., UN, and South Korean troops were locked in a high-speed tug-of-war that covered the entire peninsula. But that speed didn't last. By 1951, the front froze, literally and figuratively. Winters were punishing. At the Battle of Choshin Reservoir, U.S. Marines faced Chinese forces in mountainous terrain where temperatures dropped below minus 13 degrees Fahrenheit, minus 25 degrees Celsius. Weapons jammed. Medicine froze in its vials. Medics had to carry plasma inside their coats to keep it from solidifying. Thousands suffered frostbite so severe it ended in amputation. Some were injured before they even fired a shot. And then there was the fighting, which was relentless. Hills had to be taken one at a time. Forests, cities, rice paddies, each offered different kinds of misery. Troops climbed into close-quarters combat against fortified positions with little intel and even less air support. Artillery barrages became the norm. Resupply was slow, and the mountainous terrain made every movement a gamble. By mid-war, much of the combat resembled World War I. Static trenches, constant shelling, weeks of grinding for a few hundred yards, and always under threat. Snipers, mortar fire, and sudden assaults never stopped. Behind the lines, it wasn't much better. Prisoners of war on both sides endured disease, beatings, and political indoctrination. In the north, camps were brutal. Malnutrition and untreated illnesses were rampant. UN forces also held thousands of North Korean and Chinese prisoners under uncertain conditions, often without clear rules or oversight. Medical care improved over time. MASH units, mobile army surgical hospitals, were introduced, and helicopter medevacs became more common. But the cold, terrain, and frontline chaos meant that evacuation was often delayed or impossible. By the war's end in 1953, an estimated 600,000 to 1 million soldiers had lost their lives, with total casualties, including civilians, reaching 2 to 3 million. The border barely changed. For the men who fought in it, Korea wasn't a forgotten war. It was unforgettable. For many soldiers, the Crimean War became a death sentence. Fought between 1853 and 1856, the war saw Russia facing off against a coalition of Britain, France, the Ottoman Empire, and Sardinia. Most of the combat centered around the Crimean Peninsula. Soldiers lived for months in open trenches under constant artillery fire. Winter of 1854 to 1855 hit hard. Thousands lacked coats, boots, or even tents. Supply lines broke down. Rations froze or rotted. Ammunition ran out. Men were taken by the cold before they even saw the enemy. But the most lethal force wasn't the opposing enemy or the cold. It was disease. Over 2/3 of British fatalities came not from combat, but from illness, like cholera, typhus, and dysentery, all flourishing in overcrowded, unwashed camps. Latrines overflowed. Drinking water was often pulled from polluted streams. Cleanliness was logistically impossible. Field hospitals were disasters. Most had no running water, no sanitation, and no understanding of infection. Surgery was done with unwashed tools and limited or no anesthesia. No antiseptics either. Patients were laid side by side in filthy wards, left to bleed on straw mats. Food shortages only made things worse. Spoiled meat and hard biscuits were the only rations at times. Outbreaks of scurvy left men too weak to fight. Bathing was rare. Clothing went unchanged for weeks. Lice and infection spread through every regiment. And behind it all, communication failed. Supply orders vanished. Reinforcements arrived late. Uniforms and rifles were outdated. Entire units were sent into battle underfed, underdressed, and underinformed. By the time the war ended, an estimated 400 to 600,000 soldiers never returned home. The Russo-Japanese War was a turning point for empires, but for the soldiers on the ground, it was a preview of hell. Fought between 1904 and 1905, the war pitted Imperial Japan against Tsarist Russia over control of Manchuria and Korea. It was the first time an Asian power defeated a major European army, and it didn't come cheap. On land, the fighting centered around Port Arthur, Liaoyang, and Mukden. These weren't fast-moving battles. They were slow, grinding sieges. At Port Arthur alone, nearly 100,000 men became casualties during months of trench warfare, disease, and bombardment. Both sides dug in. Trenches stretched across frozen hills and muddy plains. Artillery never stopped. Infantry charges across open ground became routine, with little chance of making it through alive. Soldiers lived in mud bunkers, under constant shelling, often with no winter gear, no sanitation, and no rotation off the line. The winter of 1904 to 1905 was brutal. Temperatures plunged well below freezing. Medical evacuation was rare. Many wounded were left where they fell, exposed to the elements for hours or days. Frostbite, typhoid, dysentery were all in abundance. Russia's supply lines were a joke. It was a single rail line across Siberia, and it couldn't keep up. Food and ammunition arrived late, if at all. Japanese logistics were better, but still overwhelmed. Troops often went hungry, slept in open trenches, and fought without basic supplies. And the sea wasn't safer. At the Battle of Tsushima, the Russian Baltic Fleet, after sailing halfway around the world, was nearly wiped out in a single day. Sailors, already exhausted and demoralized, lost their lives in fire or drowned after months in cramped, disease-ridden ships. By the war's end, an estimated 130 to 150,000 soldiers perished, with 400 to 500,000 more wounded or sick. There were no real rest periods, no safe rear zones, no clean breaks from combat. It was attrition without relief, a brutal grind that offered no reward to those who endured it. Thank you for watching the video. I hope you enjoyed it. What do you think? Which of these wars would have been the worst to be in as a soldier? And what wars did we miss? We'd love to hear your comments below. There should be another video on your screen right now that YouTube thinks you might like, so check it out. Thanks again. See you next time.